The dusty box of photographs stood forgotten in the corner of the attic. I found it while looking for old things during renovations of our house, which had been in the family for generations. No one knew how many hidden corners the house held, or how many eerie stories it could tell. As I sifted through the worn, yellowed pictures, I found one that immediately caught my eye. In the photo were two figures, Mr. and Mrs. Hestefai. Their faces looked unnaturally smooth, like they were made of wax. I couldn't tear my eyes away from their frozen expressions. In the background behind them stood a young tree. Something about it seemed off. The branches were unnaturally twisted, and the bark looked dark, like charred skin. I recognized it. This was the same tree that still stood in our yard, only now it had grown into a massive oak. A chill ran down my spine as if icy fingers had touched me. Then I noticed something else. Around the tree, blurred shapes seemed to move, as if something ethereal had been captured on film. Trying to focus on the details, I felt a slight jolt, like an electric shock. The picture before me seemed to pulse, and for a moment it looked like the tree was moving. I blinked and set the photo aside, but a nagging voice inside urged me to check the tree. Something was wrong. I dropped the photo and went outside. The sun was setting, and the shadows of the trees were growing longer, turning the familiar yard into a haunting place. The oak, which I had seen every day for years, suddenly seemed foreign and terrifying. I headed toward it, feeling like my feet were moving on their own, as if something unseen was guiding me. As I approached the tree, I noticed that its bark was covered in strange symbols. I traced my fingers along the carvings, circles, lines, triangles, and something resembling a face with hollow eyes. They had been crudely etched into the wood, but so deeply that it seemed as though these symbols had always been part of the tree, fused with its fibers. A cold wave swept over me, even though the night was warm. It was as if the tree itself was exuding something malevolent, something ancient. On the ground beneath the tree, I saw a large, rough stone, like a marker for something important. My hands trembled, but I began to dig. The earth was dry, as if it hadn't seen rain in years. After several minutes, I struck something hard. A book. Old, decayed, barely held together, but still intact. I pulled it out, feeling an ominous change in the air. The leaves of the oak rustled as though invisible hands were brushing against them. The air became thick and suffocating. I opened the book, and as soon as I read the first page, I felt a strange pressure in my chest. The words were in a language I didn't recognize, yet I could read them, as if they had always been in my mind. After reading just a few lines, I noticed that the atmosphere around me had shifted. The moon disappeared behind the clouds, and the air began to smell of decay. The ground beneath me trembled slightly, as though something living was stirring deep beneath the tree's roots. My heart pounded in my chest. I quickly shut the book, but it was too late. I had already drawn attention to myself. I ran back inside, not daring to look back, and headed straight for my grandmother, who had lived in an annex to the house for years. She was over 70, but her memory was sharp, and she knew everything about the history of our home. When I told her about the photograph and showed her the book, her face paled. "You found it?" she whispered, her trembling hand brushing the book's cover. "Found what? What is this book?" I asked, feeling the dread rise in my throat. "The Hestefais, they didn't just disappear," she spoke in a shaky voice. "They were said to be involved in black magic to summon something that was supposed to give them eternal life. But on the night they performed their final ritual, something went terribly wrong. They vanished without a trace, and their souls are said to be bound to this house. People stopped living here after strange events began to occur. No one knew what became of them, but everyone knew one thing: whoever finds their book brings misfortune to the family." I began to piece things together. The book I found was the key to whatever Mr. and Mrs. Hestefai had been hiding. Grandmother told me their rituals always revolved around the oak tree growing in our yard. That tree had witnessed the darkest of things that happened in our home. It was linked to something old and malevolent. That night, as I lay in my room, I couldn't sleep. The book sat on the table, but its presence could be felt even in the darkness. The wind outside picked up, and I swore I could hear whispers, faint but growing louder, coming from somewhere outside. The walls trembled as though something unseen was knocking from the other side. I shut my eyes, but moments later I heard a creak. My gaze slowly shifted to the window. Through the glass, in the moonlight, I saw figures, shadows slowly advancing toward the house. Tall, thin, with hollow eyes, they moved like mist, weaving between the trees. A sense of doom and horror washed over me. The shadows outside the window moved unevenly, as if the space around them was warping. I couldn't take my eyes off their hollow sockets, and a feeling overcame me that something terrible was about to happen. I wanted to run, to hide, but my legs felt like they were glued to the floor. All I could do was watch as the figures slowly approached the house. Suddenly, there was a dull knock at the door behind me. I flinched and looked back. The door to the room was slightly ajar, and in the dim light of the hallway I saw my grandmother. Her face was pale and she was trembling all over. "They're coming for you," she whispered. "You shouldn't have touched the book. Now they need a sacrifice." My eyes instinctively darted to the table where the old book lay. Fear gave way to some grim realization. All this time, for all these decades, Mr. and Mrs. Hestefai had been waiting for someone to disturb their rest. Their ritual wasn't complete, and now they had returned for what was theirs. "What should I do?" I asked, still not taking my eyes off the book. "How do I stop them?" Grandmother stepped into the room shaking as if an invisible terror was consuming her. She came closer and stood by the table. Her gaze was fixed on the book, filled with pain and fear. "You can't stop them," she said softly, "but you can trick them. They're looking for a sacrifice, for someone to complete their ritual. But if you can close the book before they take you, maybe they'll retreat. But do it quickly. Once they enter, it's all over." I felt a chill creeping into the room, and suddenly the lamp on the table began to flicker. Everything around me seemed unnaturally dark. I heard the windows creaking as though something unseen was trying to pry them open. I grabbed the book, but as soon as I touched it, the pages began turning on their own, as if held by an unseen force. The figures outside the window began to dissolve like smoke, and then I realized they were already inside. Shadows crawled along the walls, slowly moving toward me. I rushed toward the book and tried to close it, but the pages resisted, as if some invisible hand held them open. My hand trembled, my heart pounded, and the whispers around me grew louder and louder. "Close it! Close it before they get in!" Grandmother cried, her voice filled with panic. I gathered all my strength, trying to shut the cursed book. It fought me like a living thing, clinging to the air or perhaps my soul, but I couldn't give up. As I reached the last page, I felt something inside me tearing, as if the tree under which the book had been buried was draining my energy. At that moment, the door burst wide open. Dark figures surged into the room, tall, gaunt Mr. Hestefai and his ghostly wife, with distorted faces as if ripped from a forgotten time. They moved toward me, their shadowy forms blending into the wallpaper and ceiling, their eyes glowing with a cold light. "You found our book," a low, raspy voice from Mr. Hestefai echoed through the walls. "Now you must pay." I stood frozen in place, but grandmother, rushing over to me, grabbed the book from my hands, her face twisted with fear and determination. "No, Hestefai, you will not take him!" she shouted and slammed the book shut with all her strength. The moment she did, the air in the room seemed to split apart. The shadows screeched, howling in inhuman agony. The windows shattered, and a cold wind burst into the room, scattering papers and curtains. The figures of Mr. and Mrs. Hestefai vanished in clouds of smoke, their faces twisted in a final cry of hate and despair. But it was too late. As the book closed, grandmother gasped for breath and collapsed onto the floor. Her face had gone pale and her eyes closed. "Grandma!" I screamed, rushing to her. I grabbed her hand, but it was cold. I felt her life slipping away as if something had drained her strength. "I stopped them," she whispered weakly. "But it came at a cost. Never open the book again." Her hand fell limply to the floor, and I realized that my grandmother had sacrificed her life to save me. Horror and grief overwhelmed me, but with them came a sense of inevitable danger. The book remained closed, but something told me that this was only a temporary victory. I knew that the story wasn't over yet. Mr. and Mrs. Hestefai had lost their sacrifice, but they wouldn't stop. The book was the key to all of this, and now it was in my hands. I buried it under the oak tree again, carefully packing the earth down, but I knew one day someone would find it again, and when they did, the shadows would return.